Mining Company. In 1888, he brought in a 10-stamp mill and began production the following year. However, high shipping costs forced him to abandon the effort, and the claims were worked only sporadically during the 1890s. The completion of the railroad to Crown King and the building of a smelter in Humboldt made mining in the area much less expensive. George Harrington had taken an option on the Orabella in 1900 and decided to have a road built from the mine to Crown King to link up with the railroad. His road reached Crown King just before the railroad did in 1904, and it did a great deal to facilitate operations south of Crown King. A post office named Harrington was established at the Orabella, and the mail riders stopped there and at the Boaz mine west of the Silver Mountains. Harrington, third from the left in the back row, was an immensely popular manager of the Orabella and could often be seen in overalls doing menial jobs around the camp. However, he was considered a bit of a spendthrift by Eastern stockholders, and he was replaced by an engineer named Schlesinger in 1905. Schlesinger began a series of unpopular economy measures, such as reducing the quantity and quality of food at the boarding house. The miners grumbled a great deal and demanded that he improve conditions. When the men had enough, they confronted Schlesinger, threatening to quit if conditions didn't improve. Schlesinger, seeing the ruin of his career, broke down and agreed to all demands. Before long, Harrington was reinstated and the camp returned to normal, but because of continuous meddling by stockholders, Harrington resigned in 1908. Since the closing of the mines, few people have lived in the Orabelle-Humbug Creek area. Two men who did and who have left names on modern maps are Al Francis and William Bell. Bell, known as Kentuck, was a Confederate Army veteran who had a cabin beside Humbug Creek a couple of miles south of Orabelle. There is little left of his cabin, but when he died he was buried on a hill across the creek, and a marble headstone was put on the grave with the inscription, Corporal William Bell, Company E, 35th Kentucky, Mounted Infantry. One of the men who buried him was Al Francis, who had been a freighter for the Orabella mine. Francis built a cabin where Jones Gulch opens onto Humbug Creek and lived there for many years. He jokingly called it Fort Misery, leading many people to mistakenly believe that there had been an army post there. Farther south on the Prescott Forest boundary there is an area called Burro John that was named after John Ravello, who was nicknamed Burro John. He had operated a saloon and whorehouse in Orabelle, but married a prostitute and moved to the site that is now named for him and built a cabin. The cabin no longer exists, but the name Burro John survives. Railroad Baron Frank Murphy, who was instrumental in getting the railroad to Crown King, took over the Crown King, Tiger, and Wildflower mines shortly after completion of the Bradshaw line. An aerial tram was built from the Wildflower mine to the mill in Crown King. Remnants of the tram can still be seen on the ridge north of town. By 1916, Murphy's properties, as well as the Savoy and Lincoln mines, had failed or closed. With the removal of the railroad in 1926, Crown King was on the verge of becoming a ghost town. It was in this year that Crown King's most famous citizen arrived, Countess Agnes Monato, who, as Agnes Sorma had been a famous European actress, came to Crown King to retire. She had been the original Nora in Ibsen's A Doll House. She married an Italian count and retired from the theater. After he died, she moved to Arizona to be close to her son, who had a ranch near Walnut Grove. The Countess spent much of her time horseback riding, until a serious fall slowed her down. She died in Crown King at the age of 63 and was buried on a knoll near her house. Later, her family had her remains moved to Italy to be buried next to her husband. She had a grand house built in Crown King, which is still in use as a summer home. One of the most enduring landmarks in Crown King is the old saloon that was moved on the backs of burros from Orabel in 1916. It was operated as a saloon and boarding house through the Depression by Tom Anderson, who had come to the area as a miner in the 1890s and stayed until his death in the 1950s. Tom was not above resorting to poaching and moonshining to support his establishment, and was often feuding with other Crown King business owners, such as Robert "Pat" Patterson, who ran the general store at the time. After Anderson died, the saloon was sold to Grant Van Tilburg, whose family had been mining and ranching in the area since 1919. Grant operated the saloon for the next 20 years and became something of a Crown King institution, much as Tom Anderson had before him. The Crown King General Store was built in 1904 when the railroad arrived in Crown King, and has doubled as the post office for most of that time. There was a church in downtown Crown King, built by George Harrington, but it burned down along with Ma Reed's boarding house in 1950. In the mid-1930s, activity returned to the Southern Bradshaws with the development of Horsethief Basin by the Civilian Conservation Corps. A CCC camp was set up at what is now the site of the Forest Service Guard Station, and work was begun on the dam, campgrounds, store, and rental cabins. In 1934, the Forest Service issued the City of Phoenix a special use permit, making Horsethief Basin a city park. There were plans to build a golf course and airstrip. Public use of the area diminished over the years, and in the mid-60s the area was returned to the Forest Service, except for the store and rental cabins, which were sold as a concession on forest land. There are still a few miners and prospectors in the Bradshaws looking for another strike, but their projects are usually short-lived and unsuccessful. Crown King has returned to life as a summer home and tourist area, even though the bad roads tend to discourage the less determined tourists and campers. It is a unique tourist destination, combining beautiful scenery with a fascinating look at an early mining town that still retains its Old West flavor.